Liam's statement was shockingly callous, delivered with a disturbing lack of remorse. Your mom's going to pass away soon, right? There's no need for us to work once we get the inheritance, he said, his face betraying no hint of malice. I was so enraged by his words that I was left utterly speechless. He continued with a disturbing casualness. Actually, I've been visiting your mom recently just to get some pocket money. She looks pretty frail. I think it's going to be soon. I can hardly wait for the inheritance. As he spoke, a smug smile spread across his face, almost as if he were about to hum a tune while fiddling with his smartphone. In that moment, it became painfully clear that Liam was a demon in disguise, his pretended goodness overshadowed by his greed. The realization that he had even sold the violin my mother cherished turned my disappointment into despair. I am Lucy, a 37-year-old housewife who married Leah last year. We lived together without children. I met Liam at work when he joined as a temp. His aloof and unmotivated demeanor troubled those in charge of training, so I was assigned to him. When I asked why he hadn't taken his training seriously, Liam responded, "Well, the trainer was an older man. If a beautiful lady like you had been teaching me from the start, maybe I would have tried harder." He said this with a grin, staring at me, and his unexpected charm stirred something within me. Despite being in his 30s, Liam had a charisma that triggered a maternal instinct, not just in me but even in older female supervisors. Seeing him get close to other female staff sparked jealousy in me. As if sensing my feelings, Liam said, "I want to be trained specially by you, Lucy," with an innocent smile that made my heart flutter. At that moment, I could understand why women fall for charming young men. My mother, Amy, had been battling a chronic illness that made it difficult for her to leave bed. She chose to rest at home rather than be hospitalized. Our company, where Liam and I worked, was part of a business run by my mother. As her health worsened, I faced various management and financial issues. Considering my mother's needs, I decided to take a temporary break from work. During this time, just as I was preparing for a breakup with Liam, he unexpectedly proposed a relationship. "I want to be with you forever," he said, and thus our romance began. After dating and considering marriage, I introduced Liam to my mother. Despite her illness, she seemed to regain some energy and brighten up around him. I couldn't help but think Liam had a charm that captivated even older women, and I was pleased with their good relationship. Later, at my insistence, Liam agreed to take on the family name of Campbell, and we got married. Throughout our relationship, Liam's baby-like traits were apparent. I always paid for our dates, and even a year into our marriage, it was rare for Liam to handle any payments. He would stand aside during the bill, looking at me with sweet eyes, silently asking me to pay. Given that Liam was a temp and my income was higher, we weren't struggling financially thanks to my savings. When I asked him if he didn't have any pride as a man for always letting me pay, he cheerfully responded, "Pride? I don't have that. Nowadays, it's normal for women to earn, so it's all good." Although he was currently a temp worker, I believed he could become a full-time employee if he took his work more seriously. I took pride in having thoroughly coached Liam in business manners and work attitude, hoping he would understand the significance and responsibilities of married life. But my expectations were shattered when Liam quit his job abruptly. When I asked him why, his response was shockingly devoid of guilt. "Well, your mom's going to pass away soon, right? We'll get the inheritance, so there's no need to work." I was beyond angry, left dumbfounded by his words. Liam continued, "Actually, I've been visiting your mom recently to get some pocket money. She looked pretty bad. I think it's going to be soon. I can't wait for the inheritance." He said this with a smile, almost humming a tune, while fiddling with his smartphone. At that moment, Liam appeared angelic but was a devil at heart. And now, as the afternoon arrived, I find myself at my mother's house. My sister Millie, who married early and whose children are now in college living elsewhere, has returned home. Her husband, Sean, is on an overseas assignment, so she is staying with our mother. I handle our mother's care while Millie is at work in the mornings. The other day, Liam came by for a visit. Millie mentioned that he claimed he was just stopping by, but he ended up taking some pocket money from Mom and left. I was disappointed to hear this. Liam has been visiting our mother frequently in my absence and seems to be receiving money from her. When I introduced Liam to my mother before we married, he must have noticed her considerable fortune. It seems he quit his job, relying on the inheritance he expects from her. He's like a greedy hyena. The house where my mother lives sits on a hilltop, distinguished by its grand gate, a legacy from my late father, who was also quite wealthy. After my father's death, my mother took over his businesses and further increased their wealth. Her businesses alone are now worth around $7 million. Liam's interest in the house, particularly in the violin displayed in a showcase in my mother's room, is troubling. The violin is a memento from my father, who was a musician. Despite the wealth we have, my mother always said that the violin is her most treasured possession. Liam, with his sharp eye for money, naturally took an interest in it. I told Millie that if Liam comes by again, she shouldn't give him any more money, but I worry that Mom might still give in. It's a troubling situation. It's been just over a year since I married Liam, and I'm starting to think seriously about our future. Seeing my distress, Millie tried to comfort me, saying, "There are men who depend on wealthy women. Maybe Liam is one of them. Don't worry, even if you decide to divorce, you'll be okay." "I'll support you, Lucy," Millie said, her words a source of encouragement. Maybe Liam would change, or maybe divorce was an option I could consider. That day, however, brought an unexpected turn in my mother's condition. After breakfast, she suddenly began to suffer. Thankfully, both Millie and I were at her house that morning and noticed immediately when she fell into a coma. The doctor arrived quickly and told us to prepare for the worst. Millie and I held back our tears and stayed strong. My mother clung to life until the next day, during which time Millie's children and Sean, who had returned from his overseas assignment, arrived. Despite having received money from my mother, Liam didn't show up. It was his last chance to see her. That night, as our family kept vigil, my mother passed away peacefully without suffering. Sean and the kids were overwhelmed with grief, and I was deeply saddened as well. However, having been prepared by the doctor, Millie and I immediately began making funeral arrangements. Thanks to our prior preparations and contacts, everything proceeded smoothly. I sent a text to Liam informing him of my mother's passing and the funeral details, but received no reply. Assuming he might be in shock, I waited, hoping he would attend. During the funeral, Millie and I were grateful for the support of those who had been kind to my mother throughout her life, company executives, longtime friends, and many others. I was touched by how loved she was, which gave me a sense of fulfillment. In the midst of this, Sean came to me in tears. I planned to place Mom's cherished violin at the funeral, but when I went to get it, it was gone, he said. I was shocked and exclaimed, "What?" It was evident that someone had broken into my mother's house during the busy funeral preparations. I recalled that Liam had shown a particular interest in the violin. I quickly contacted Liam, who had yet to show up at the funeral. Surprisingly, he answered on the second call. "Liam, how are you? I heard you were coming to the funeral. Where are you?" I asked urgently. He laughed on the other end of the line. "All these sudden questions are funny. Your mother passed away, right? It took longer than I expected. I was getting tired of waiting." I wanted to yell at him for his insensitivity, but managed to restrain myself and urged him to come to the funeral. His reply was staggering. "I'm in the middle of a transaction. A collector wants to buy your mother's violin. I'm finalizing the sale now." I was overwhelmed with disbelief. Liam was actually selling my mother's violin. "Liam, stop that transaction immediately. You're going to cause a lot of trouble," I implored desperately. Selling the violin, which my mother had treasured, was unforgivable. "That's impossible," Liam replied dismissively. "The buyer is fully committed and has already prepared the cash. Sorry, I'm busy. I'll hang up now. Good luck with the funeral. Bye." With that, Liam ended the call. I was too shaken to discuss Liam's actions at the funeral, and decided I would talk to Millie and Sean about it later. Liam's greed had driven him to sell my mother's precious violin. This was the final blow to my already fragile trust in him. If someone chooses to depend on a woman for financial support, that's their choice. If they find someone willing to accept that, so be it. But I won't assist someone who repays kindness with ingratitude. I vowed never to forgive him. After the funeral, the three of us found a moment of respite at my mother's house. Although the service was over, not everything was resolved. We still had to address the extensive business affairs my mother had managed. However, the most urgent issue was Liam's absence. His failure to appear in the sale of the violin was the final straw. "I haven't told Millie and Sean about the violin yet," I said, feeling a deep sense of disillusionment. "If we can't find it, we might need to involve the police." Millie, unaware of the full story, voiced her concern. "Right, we might have to rely on the police. Sister, I've called someone who might know about the violin. Let's hear what he has to say." I looked toward the door. "Oh, look, he seems to be arriving now," I said as we prepared to meet him. I heard the roar of a powerful engine as it approached the house. It came to a stop, and with a sharp thud of the door closing, Liam walked in without using the intercom. "Lucy, the funeral must have been tough," he said, his tone disturbingly casual. "Did you collect a decent number of sympathy cards?" His lack of empathy was infuriating. Millie and Sean exchanged disapproving glances. "Liam, what were you thinking? Not showing up at the funeral after everything Mother did for you? Aren't you saddened by her death?" I could barely contain my anger. Liam shrugged. "Of course I'm sad. I won't be getting my allowance anymore. When I went gambling with Amy's money, I often won big. People with money seem to have better luck." His words seemed designed to provoke us further. Then he brought up the violin. "I guess you don't get the inheritance right away. I made a little miscalculation. I couldn't wait for the inheritance procedures, so I had an acquaintance sell the violin from Amy's room." Millie looked stunned. "You sold it? That violin?" Sean's expression mirrored her surprise. Liam, with a hint of pride, added, "It sold for $200,000. I bought a new car with that money." Millie's face turned red as she burst into laughter, and Sean soon joined in. Liam looked confused and annoyed. "Did it really sell for $200,000? Millie managed between laughs. "Yes, it did," Liam said, trying to hold on to his composure. I maintained my calm demeanor and said, "I feel really sorry for you, Liam." His face reddened with anger, a rare sight that oddly cheered me up. "Is that the sound of your new car arriving?" I asked half-jokingly. Liam, slightly irked, began to boast about his new purchase. Yes, it was a challenge climbing the steep hill to this house, but the new car made it easy. Seeing Liam's prideful demeanor, Millie shifted the topic. "Liam, this could be problematic. You shouldn't have sold that violin. It might be a crime." Liam's face showed a flicker of shock. "What do you mean?" Millie explained. "That violin was a copy. The craftsmanship was so elaborate that it might have looked like the real thing, but anyone knowledgeable about violins would recognize it immediately. My father, who aspired to be a musician but couldn't afford a genuine violin, bought this replica. He cherished it deeply and even used it to propose to my mother. That's why she held on to it so dearly." The realization hit Liam hard, and his expression turned grim. I wondered how Liam had managed to sell the violin. It was likely through some shady, unreliable dealer, but it came with a certificate claiming it had once belonged to a wealthy individual, which might have attracted an eager buyer right away. Millie and I sighed in disbelief, appalled by Liam's thoughtlessness. "Liam, did you even read that certificate properly? It wasn't a genuine certificate of authenticity. It was actually a love letter in the form of a certificate that my father gave to my mother when he proposed. I'd love to see the buyer's reaction when they realize what they've got." Liam looked uncomfortable at my words, but I had no sympathy for him. Even though it was a replica, selling such a cherished item of my mother's without her permission was unforgivable. I didn't bother hiding my anger. Just then, Liam's cell phone rang. His face turned pale as he answered. The angry voice on the other end was unmistakable. "What the hell did you do? I'm getting complaints from the buyer. It's obviously a fake. You can tell just by looking at it. Return the $200,000 immediately, or I'll report you to the police." The threat was exactly what I had anticipated. The caller was likely the dealer who helped with the sale. It was clear that neither the dealer nor the buyer had properly verified the item before proceeding. If the violin had been a genuine copy, anyone knowledgeable about violins should have been able to spot it. Despite the sentimental value my mother placed on it, the violin wasn't actually worth $200,000. The fact that a poorly written certificate didn't excuse the failure to recognize it as a copy was troubling. Liam continued to make excuses to the dealer, but it was clear his only options were to return the money or face legal consequences. Reluctantly, he would have to give up his newly purchased car. After ending the call, Liam looked utterly defeated. Seeing his downfall, Millie and Sean exchanged glances, their expressions almost reflecting a sense of vindication. I chuckled despite the situation, thinking that as long as my mother's precious violin was returned, that was all that mattered. However, it was clear that those who commit wrongs eventually face the consequences. At that moment, Sean, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Liam, even if you have to give up the car, where is it? Didn't you drive it here?" Prompted by Sean's question, I looked outside. Liam's car, which should have been parked in front of the house, was nowhere to be seen. That can't be, Liam stammered. I locked it and had the keys. Realization seemed to hit him, and he dashed out of the house barefoot. But the car was gone. It appeared to have rolled down the hill and crashed into the fence of a nearby house. How careless can you be? Did you forget to set the handbrake? I sighed as I watched Liam run off in a panic. The front of the car was badly damaged, making it unlikely he'd be able to sell it now. Repair costs would likely be substantial. That house your car hit belongs to the local gang leader who's lived here for years, I muttered to myself. You're really in trouble now. Despite Liam's actions as a family, we felt the need to make amends for what he had done. The gang leader, who had been a close friend of my mother and even attended her funeral, was a gentleman. He offered his condolences for my mother's death and noticed my husband hadn't been present at the funeral. Given that this recent commotion was entirely Liam's fault, it was decided that he alone should bear the responsibility. On my way back, I saw the damage to the beautiful brick wall of the house that the car had hit. It was disheartening to see it broken. When I got home, Liam started talking about the inheritance again. Lucy, when will we get the inheritance? It was so close. If it weren't for my mother-in-law's inheritance. Liam seemed relieved as he spoke. I would have been completely stuck without this. I had to confront him with the reality he was misunderstanding. What are you talking about? There's no inheritance money for you. Liam looked shocked. As a son-in-law and not even an adopted child, he had no right to any inheritance. But I was looking forward to it, he said, clearly not grasping the situation. His insensitivity was astounding. But Lucy, you'll inherit, right? Shouldn't there be something for me? He continued, still fixated on the money. I almost cried at his continued focus on financial gain. I pulled out some photos from my bag and spread them on the table. Liam's eyes widened in astonishment as he saw them. I regret marrying you, I said, my voice steady despite the anger boiling inside me. Marriage involves responsibility and commitment, not just personal gain. The photos depicted Liam in intimate moments with other women, clear evidence of his infidelity. The detective had done a thorough job capturing him entering rooms and getting close to several women. I had hoped to believe in our marriage, but doubts grew with each day he came home smelling of perfume. Liam made no attempt to deny his actions, only looking bewildered at being caught. You really don't understand, Liam. We're getting a divorce and I'll be seeking compensation for emotional distress, I said firmly. Liam objected vehemently, though it was clear he had no claim to any inheritance. You don't work, you just beg for money and cheat. What's the point of being married to you? I'd be better off with a pet dog or cat, I added, my frustration evident. As I spoke, Liam began to cry. He looked up at me with tearful eyes like a lost puppy. Don't leave me. You said you wanted to be together. That wasn't a lie, right? I'm sorry. I'll do better. Please stay with me. I was momentarily swayed but quickly regained my resolve. I'm not the person I used to be. We can't live together anymore. It's time for you to be independent. Millie shone, and I couldn't hide our astonishment. At that moment, the intercom rang. A police officer arrived. I had called them to report the stolen violin. The officer explained that Liam was being arrested based on the theft report. Liam, still crying, protested loudly, questioning why theft within a family couldn't be overlooked. His loud admissions of guilt were almost pitiful, but theft remains a crime, even among family members. As Liam was escorted into the police car, I whispered softly, "Goodbye. I'm sorry, Mom, for all this. If you have anything to say, please come to me in my dreams." I prayed before my mother's portrait, feeling the weight of the situation. Liam was charged with several crimes, including the theft of the violin and a fraud lawsuit from the buyer who had paid $200,000 for what turned out to be a fake. The outcome was uncertain, with additional claims for the repair costs of the neighbor's wall and damages. In the midst of divorce mediation, I relayed that the few assets we had built together were negligible. The only real treasure was the family violin, which I managed to retrieve for $200,000 after explaining the situation to the buyer. Getting the violin back was my priority, and I intended to make Liam repay the full amount. Millie, looking a bit lonely since Scene had gone back overseas, advised, "Lucy, be careful with men who are like pets." Liam's mistresses, uncovered by the detective, had been women he depended on financially. He had told his lawyer he wanted to show them a good time, but now he was irrelevant to me. I regretted how I had been back then. The detective revealed that Liam was estranged from his parents, who were fed up with his constant reliance on women. I understood that feeling all too well now. Liam's dependence on others, once a convenient arrangement, had proven unsustainable. I hoped Liam would take this opportunity to reassess himself, work seriously, and learn the value of money. Having ended my leave of absence, I returned to work. The company my mother left behind would be taken over by Sean, who would soon be returning from abroad. After enjoying breakfast prepared by the now cheerful Millie, I put on my coat to head to work. Before leaving, I paused to look at the photos of my parents and prayed. "Dad, Mom, let's have a good day today," I said, opening the front door and stepping into a new chapter of my life.